We're going to get started. If you're being patient. Welcome to Super's teach-in, The Right to Resist, Al-Aqsa Flood Armed Resistance. Before we begin, we just have a few space orientation and reminders. Please mask indoors. This is a mass event. We keep each other safe. Also includes COVID safety. We will break for food outside about halfway through the presentation. Bathrooms are down the hall and either up the stairs or down the stairs, whichever you choose. And also some of the content may be triggering. Please make sure to take care of your needs. Feel free to step outside if you need to. No one's going to judge you. For our agenda, our first section will cover an introduction to Palestine, Al-Aqsa Flood, and armed resistance as a scientific necessity. Then we'll have an activity. We'll break for dinner. Then we'll have our second section, which will include Where Are We Now?, Western Propaganda, Genocidal Goals of Israel, Wins of the Palestinian and Regional Resistance, and a discussion. Finally, Super, which the organization putting on this teach-in, is a student group at the University of Washington dedicated to liberation and the return for Palestinian people. We hold educational awareness and speaker events in solidarity with the Palestinian people and work against Zionism and imperialism at our institution. So our first section will establish the conditions leading up to Al-Aqsa Flood and go over a brief history of Palestine. We're here to talk about armed resistance as a necessity, historical, determined part of struggles for liberation. Specifically, we want to talk about Al-Aqsa Flood, the military operation that the Palestinian resistance launched on October 7th, 2023. Yeah, that slide's fine. And why we support Al-Aqsa Flood as a day of decolonization and liberation, and as a fundamental turning point within the world's history. But first, we need to establish a bit of a historical basis here so we can understand the situation that led up to Al-Aqsa Flood. Before we begin, I want to establish some basic facts about Palestine. Firstly, Palestine contains the holy sites for the three major Abrahamic religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. Secondly, the definition of indigeneity or indigenous is a group of people that have a historical and continued geographic and temporal connection to land and related ancestral traditions. The Zionist movement has always been a settler-colonial project, and although they have utilized biblical narratives and therefore their supposed indigeneity to lay claim to the land, indigeneity is not about claimed and ancient ancestral religious claims, but rather continued geographic and temporal connection to the land. Humans do migrate and move, but indigeneity is a generational connection to the land, and European Jews do not have that. The founders of Zionism understood this as settler colonialism. To them, becoming the colonists was the answer to anti-Semitism. In 1947, the newly created United Nations adopted the Partition of Palestine, which established the state of Israel and allocated most of Palestine's land for a minority of Jewish settlers. This kicked off the 1948 Nakba, or the catastrophe, which was the ethnic cleansing and expulsion of over 700,000 Palestinians from Palestine, or 85% of the total population of Palestine at the time. Many forms of struggle have, you can go to the next slide. Many forms of struggle have been attempted by the Palestinian people. The first major one was the Great Strike in 1936, which was a popular resistance movement against British occupation and Jewish immigration. And it was violently suppressed by the British over the course of 3 years. By the end of the 1950s, young activists had formed several political parties with various ideologies. These Fedayeen, or guerrillas, championed armed struggle against the Zionist project as the sole means of liberating Palestine, and encouraged the Palestinian masses to take up and support the struggle. They were successful at creating a Palestinian mass movement and reawakening popular political consciousness. These groups eventually took over the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO, and formed other resistance groups like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Later, in the 1980s and the early 2000s, the first and second intifadas were mass uprisings sparked either by Zionist violence against Palestinians, in the case of the first intifada, or the events surrounding the Oslo Accords, in the case of the second intifada. Both included massive protests, civil disobedience actions, boycotts, and other forms of resistance. Both were also met with incredible repression and extreme violence. This response by the Zionist project soon pushed Palestinians towards more militarized tactics, including guerrilla warfare and suicide bombings. Next slide. The Oslo Path, or the Oslo Accords, were a proposed diplomatic solution between 1993 and 1999 between the Zionist project and the PLO, which would have established two states, basically the two-state solution. The two-states solution would be understood as permanent colonization of Palestine by the Zionist entity. The Oslo Accords have not accomplished what they actually promised to accomplish. What they have done is create the Palestinian Authority, a corrupt force that coordinates with the Zionist entity, and it destroyed the power built during the First Intifada, and for the first time was the official recognition of the Zionist State of Israel from a Palestinian Liberation Organization. The result of the Oslo Accords: more ethnic cleansing, routine killing, and the normalization of the Zionist occupation and increased settlements in the West Bank and Jerusalem. Next slide. Pre-Al-Aqsa Flood, Palestinians were living under brutal apartheid rule. The definition of apartheid is the implementation and maintenance of a system of legalized racial segregation in which one racial group is deprived of political and civil rights. You may know this more commonly in the context of South Africa, but it's a system that has been implemented across the world, including in Palestine. Palestinians were regularly deprived of food, water, and shelter, and they were forced to use different passageways from Israelis and were regularly stopped and harassed at checkpoints. The Israeli military cut off water in north of Hebron using cement and regularly cuts off electricity and water supply. In 2022, the unemployment rate for Palestinians was 46%, and 62% of the Palestinian population were underfed and in need of food assistance. Starting in 2007, the Zionist project illegally imposed a blockade of the Gaza Strip, severely restricting the amount of food, fuel, and other aid vehicles that could enter. This further worsened conditions in Gaza. In 2024, only 64% of requests to leave Gaza for medical treatment were approved, and many died waiting for approval. Before Al-Aqsa Flood, there were over 5,000 Palestinian political prisoners in Zionist prisons at any given time. It was commonplace for Palestinians to be held without charges, trials, or sentences. There are hundreds of books written about the horrific treatment of Palestinians by the Zionist entity, too much for us to cover in this teach-in, but pretty much anything that you can think of, the Zionist entity has done to Palestinians. Now we're going to watch a quick clip which illustrates how, if it'll load, which illustrates how apartheid functioned day to day. Yeah, let's see if we can get it to work. If we can get the sound over, it's okay. And it's in, yeah, studio, so.
This is only here. من هون أوسع هذا. They are يهودين. هاك يهودين. وهناك عربيين. يلا. لا تشيل يهودين وعربيين. لا ما هون كيف؟ لا كيف كيف؟ لا تقول.
يعطيك العافية. هلا احنا بدنا نفسركم ايش بدهم يعملوا هون الجيش. بدهم يعملوا سوق، بس مش سوق بطون، جدار. ايش نضيف وجديد. وسع مترين او متر ونص من الجدار قد ما نقدر نعمل عشان يكون ممر زي رصيف او ممر. معناته هذا الممر بيكون مفتوح من هون لفوق بيكون مفتوح.
יש לך חוק לעבור, החוק זה לעבור הצד השני, יאללה. למה? ככה, ככה, כאן הצד של יהודי, כאן הצד הערבי. מה תגיד לי אין ככה?
So as you can see, Palestinians were prevented from going in the pathways built for Jews and were required to take a separate path. Now we're going to talk about the Iron Dome era. After the blockade of the Gaza Strip and the creation of the Palestinian Authority and the end of the Second Intifada, the Palestinian struggle entered an era that we can refer to as the Iron Dome era. Following the construction of the Iron Dome in occupied Palestine, which was an air defense system implemented by the Zionist entity around areas controlled by them, the struggle entered a historical freeze of resistance, where there was a false belief in an established status quo of Israeli occupation. The Zionist project's so-called Iron Dome was an air defense system implemented around Zionist-controlled land. This led to a constant struggle and destruction of Palestine, resistance, Zionist response, devastation of Palestine, and then more resistance. This policy, which for the past decade was consensus for both the right and the center of Israeli politics, was that of a low-maintenance, perpetual occupation as a permanent state of affairs for Palestine. You could call it the Iron Dome era. Every aspect of the Israeli state, from its domestic policy to its foreign policy to its political discourse, had operated for a decade under the assumption that the long-standing conflict was contained. This fact was supposed to give the country stability, security, and diplomatic openings with its Arab neighbors for the indefinite future. The Palestinian struggle was falling on deaf international ears, and reactionary Arab countries were moving towards normalization.
Great. So we're going to switch off. Thank you so much for kind of establishing the conditions and context in Palestine. And this might be a term people have heard of before, armed struggle as a scientific necessity. Today, we really want to talk about the tactic of armed struggle, or the usage of weapons and force in fighting a violent oppressor. And not only are we going to share why armed struggle is a logical step in liberation, we're going to show past examples, past movements that have successfully employed this tactic, and prove that it's not just a cycle of revolution that is foretold to repeat every 100 or 300 years. It's a scientific necessity. So it's actually going to take you guys back a little bit to maybe science class. Anyone here remember the scientific method? Can I get a raise of hands? Okay, great. We're educated. And so, again, we hear this term scientific a lot. We think it references like biology, chemistry, kind of STEM-related things. But what happens when we put history to science? So the term itself of like scientific necessity or something being scientific lends itself to multiple political frameworks. But in this presentation, we thought it'd be really great to cover something that people might be familiar with. If you need a refresher, the scientific method, popularized by Western nations, but actually the process of observation, analysis, and experimentation has long existed, is kind of part of human condition and human evolution. And in the end, we can try to determine a scientifically sound conclusion that either accepts the hypothesis or rejects the hypothesis. And in Super, we're historical materialists. So once again, we believe that in order to properly understand history and to correctly analyze the present, we need to look at what has materially happened. Oftentimes, those same Western kind of textbooks are written by the oppressors who have completed their suppression of revolutionary activity. And so we hope that today we can really center in on the facts and get to a scientifically sound conclusion. Okay, sweet. So super exciting. It's gonna be interactive, so please feel free to share. Really quick, what are some observations of Palestine's current condition? Like literally ones that were just covered in the last section of the presentation. Anything stick out or things that we didn't cover too? Apartheid. Oh yeah, go ahead. Being cut off from aid. Yes, being cut off from aid or very restrictive. One more? Yeah. Yes, yes, definitely. Like we hear like the basic resources of life being restricted or cut off because of racial, ethnic status, religious status. Other things I know that we didn't cover today are kind of how like ecocide has been waged in Palestine. So that's manipulation of the land in ways that are very deleterious for ancestral traditions and also just the land itself. And so, oh yeah, maybe. If you click. Great. Okay, so I think
We click
this
forward.
one.
Yeah, it's up there now.
Oh, sweet. Okay. Yes, systemic oppression, settler colonialism, ethnic cleansing of Palestinians are all things that were very easy to observe, although the international community might, not have the media focus on it. But these are things that were observed prior to 2023. Okay, I'm going to help you guys out and pose the question because, there could be tons of questions that we could try to answer today. But really, the question that we hope this activity does is, what is the path to Palestinian liberation? I said before, there's, no matter who you ask, there's probably many, many different answers, or, people in my DMs say there's many answers and that I don't agree with. But that being said, the next stage kind of in the scientific method is the hypothesis stage. So there's, again, probably been many tools or tactics or programs that people have suggested to achieve Palestinian liberation. Some include like winning the consensus of the international community. Some include, awareness. Like awareness will bring liberation. But I'm curious, are there any other hypotheses or like common phrases, as to how Palestinians may gain liberation? Like it can be one you disagree with, one you agree with. Yeah, right over here. Decolonization, yes, 100%. Like, what does that look like? But definitely, that is used a lot. Yes.
Intifada revolution.
Intifada revolution, globalized intifada, phrases like that. 100. Well, honestly, I hate to. I'm making this like less radical, but in order just to shed light on, again, the number of different ways that people have proposed solving this question, and I think it's easier for us because ultimately we have seen the failings of a lot of these tactics being waged as the primary way to gain liberation. So as we've covered in the presentation, there have been over 100 years of struggle and multiple tactics have run in tandem with each other. Based on a few of these, how do you guys think the experiments kind of that phrasing have gone? So if we're thinking, how did the Oslo path end up? Would anyone like to share? Yeah.
Wasn't Israeli Prime Minister assassinated?
In the Oslo path?
Yeah. Or is this famous?
No worries. I mean, does anyone know specifically if that was? Yeah,
well,
go
we
ahead.
know that Palestine wasn't liberated.
Yes.
But are you referring to that like settler killing ravine?
Mm-hmm.
But
Oh, the diplomat.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I can put that as a potential hypothesis or experiment, right? Yeah, go ahead.
well, I was also going to say yeah. So, I mean, the Palestinian Authority is completely an agent of the occupier power, Israel, and Israel, as we know, doesn't follow any ceasefire or negotiation, and they've only taken more land since then. And basically negotiating with Israel, or like, what's the word? Not surrendering, but like just conceding to Israel is only going to actually hurt you more in the end than continuing to resist.
Yes.
And you can even see with other countries in the region that have done that to Israel as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much for you kind of stole the words off my slide notes, but definitely the PA I think is one of the most clear examples of we have folks gunning down their own people, who they're supposed to be protecting at the directive of Israel. We're witnessing just like the failures of this prioritization of legal framework and international law will will decree that like this is not okay. But once again, I think we've unfortunately been kind of seeing this in real time. And so as we go on to the analysis part, hold up, okay. Our analysis, and I think kind of viewing the multiple experiments that have happened in real time, multiple tactics in conjunction, is that ultimately there's without a doubt that every single successful liberation or decolonial movement has included armed resistance as an essential tactic. I know this activity might simplify things as in like, oh, you know, in reality, you need a diversity of tactics. And I definitely agree with that. But again, this activity serves to highlight that the one through line between all successful liberation movements is the waging of armed struggle to achieve liberation. Oh, great. Yes, I will do that next time. And so I'll let people, you know, share other examples too, but off the top of our heads, you know, the abolition of slavery, liberation in Vietnam, Cuba, Zimbabwe, have all waged armed struggle as a tactic to achieve liberation. And so, again, wrapping up the conclusion of the scientific method activity, again, if one follows a hypothesis of, you know, waging armed struggle, they can tend to see success. But it also goes the other way around. So what have happened to movements that have possibly prioritized things like nonviolent strategy or reform as the main topics? Again, it's not to say that those tactics do not work, and especially in conjunction with things like armed struggle. Like, again, we're all sitting here together partaking in like political education, right? It's not, again, that those tactics are not worth achieving or not worth trying. It's just that more so the sole or heavier reliance of non-armed struggle can result in capitulation of leaders or concession of original demands. And so there's numerous cases that this has happened in. So really quickly, anti-communist genocide in Indonesia and the incomplete people's revolutions in the Philippines, where there's still resistance happening right now because liberation and equal rights were not achieved previously. So I'd like to wrap up this activity. Thank you guys for participating in some science with me by, again, I think sometimes in the West we hear there's a glorification of armed struggle, but as Fidel Castro said, revolutionaries didn't choose armed struggle as the best path. It's the path that oppressors imposed on the people. And so the people only have two choices, to suffer or to fight. Yeah, once again, I hope this activity really affirms that, once again, okay, perfect, that the people's armed struggle is a historic and scientific necessity, not something that falls out of the air, but is grown by the conditions faced by the people. And with that, we'll start the discussion with folks. We're gonna have 10 or so minutes, so I'll give a 5-minute reminder when it's time to switch over to the next set of questions. But yeah, so number one are maybe even things that we're still kind of holding, hearing this presentation, like what are some common rhetoric that we hear against armed resistance or against armed struggle, particularly, you know, in the settings that we grow up in, or even settings elsewhere. Question set number 2 is, can you name other successful movements? So I kind of gave you a little hint earlier, but there's genuinely so many more that have waged armed resistance as a tactic. What were their political conditions and contexts? And yeah, were there any other tactics in addition to armed struggle that they waged? So yes, maybe in groups of like 2 or 3 or just around y'all. Feel free to introduce like, how's your day going? Name if you're comfortable and whatnot. But yeah, I'll let you guys get into it. And discussion in the chat as well.
Should we do breakout rooms? Or no?
That's a good question.
Do y'all want breakout rooms? Yes or no? Okay, cool. Chat is fine.
Good job. Okay, let me try to set up the speaker for the other video.
what you discussed about this group at the table? What did you guys talk about?
We talked about how with armed resistance, commemorate comes to mind, about how nonviolence only really works if your opponent has a conscience, and obviously the U.S. empire does not have one. So it's not only just justifying these individual instances of armed resistance, but analyzing the conditions that are putting forth, larger movements and drawing from historical tactics. We spoke about the axis of resistance and how a lot of these countries that are still under siege and sanctioned, they're still, winning, victories against U.S. empire, especially as we're seeing their decline, like on an economic front. So when that happens, the U.S. turns to what is known the most, which is military. And yeah, so I think those kinds of scientific analyses are really key.
I'm also going to be resharing to Jitsi as people talk. But for those online, one of the things was this idea that the U.S. empire does not have a conscience. Nonviolence only works when your opponent has a conscience. And there's discussion about the axis of resistance and countries who, despite economic warfare and actual warfare from the U.S. empire, still are making military wins against the U.S. empire. Any others? Yeah? Okay. Okay, so, all right, we can go to the next slide. So we've talked now a bit about Palestine and the situation in Palestine before Al-Aqsa Flood, and discussed the importance of armed resistance as a necessary tool in all past decolonial struggles. But now we want to talk a little bit specifically about Al-Aqsa Flood, which was the military operation launched on October 7th. Al-Aqsa Flood directly confronted the U.S. empire and the Zionist occupation, and it threatens the global order of Western domination. So thus, the West has a massive investment in delegitimizing Al-Aqsa Flood. So a massive propaganda war has been launched across all sectors of the West, and the only way to cut through this propaganda is to use a materialist analysis with careful consideration of sources and information. We also, after this teach-in, will be emailing out kind of a packet of a compilation of like the resources and research that we did for this information, so people can kind of dig into that themselves. But first, we want to look at the conditions specifically in the Gaza Strip. So following Hamas's election in 2007, the Zionist entity, in coordination with Egypt, set in motion a total sea, land, and air blockade of the Gaza Strip. Movement is completely restricted, and Palestinians often die awaiting Israeli permission to seek medical treatment outside of the Strip. So as you can see here, this is the Gaza Strip. This border is 40 miles long, and the land is restricted here through guard towers, fences, cameras, and radars. And out to the sea, they have a 6 nautical mile limit. Fishermen are routinely killed in the ocean, whether or not they are beyond the 6 mile nautical limit, killed for fishing within their own oceans. And surrounding the Gaza Strip, this area here is known as the Gaza envelope. And this is an area filled with military bases. The active duty soldiers there will surveil, shoot, and threaten Palestinians, while the nearly 50,000 settlers that live in the Gaza envelope function as omnipresent guards and threats against the besieged and blockaded Gaza Strip. These settlers also, up here, both before and after Al-Aqsa Flood, engage in these sickening genocidal watch parties, where they will sit on the hillside above Gaza. They will bring snacks, music, take selfies, and they will watch as bombs drop and kill Palestinians. So the Gaza border has now become a laboratory that companies use to test and understand how to track, surveil, and maintain borders. In 2021, at the cost of over $1 billion, the The 40-mile-long border fence was upgraded with cameras, radars, and other sensors, as well as barbed wire and underground concrete barrier to prevent tunneling. In addition to the 20-foot-tall fence, observation towers like this one were placed in some areas every 500 feet with automatic mounted machine guns. This is also why, if you go down to the US-Mexican border, it is full of Israeli surveillance tech there. The Zionist entity will test surveillance tech on Gaza and then sell it back to other places like the US as quote-unquote field tested. Pictured here is a mock-up of the Tohono O'odham Reservation, which is on the Arizona-Mexican border, where the US Border Patrol installed 10 towers built in a $26 million deal with Elbit, which is Israel's biggest homegrown weapon supplier. And all of these were sold after being developed and tested against the Palestinians now used to surveil indigenous people here in the US and Mexico. So amidst these torturous conditions, the Palestinian people in Gaza have still maintained an incredible capacity for resistance and perseverance. In 2019, Hamas was involved in organizing the Great March of Return. As we talked about earlier, there are several different methods that are employed, often in conjunction with one another, to fight for liberation. The Great March of Return was an attempt at a peaceful demonstration, where Palestinians would march to the border, demanding the right to return to their ancestral homeland. In response, the Zionist entity, using tear gas canisters, rubber bullets, and live ammunition, mostly fired from snipers, killed 214 Palestinians and injured 36,000. Despite this, the resistance has continued to organize and build unity. In 2021, during Saif al-Quds, or the Sword of Jerusalem, the term the Unity of Fields began to be used. This was a battle that was fought in defense of Al-Aqsa Mosque and the repeated violations of the Zionist entity into the mosque and their attempts to efface the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in Jerusalem. And it represented a shift in how the Palestinian resistance factions in Gaza operated, viewing the primary contradiction as the Zionist occupation. So it is in these conditions, set within the larger context of the normalization of Israel, set in the context of Netanyahu waving this map of the new Middle East, claiming all of Palestine as Israeli, set among the conditions of the ethnic cleansing and expulsion and the over 5,000 Palestinians who were imprisoned by the Zionist entity, that the armed resistance moved to launch Al-Aqsa Flood. No peaceful, legalistic, or diplomatic paths remain open. The resistance and its regional allies have been able to build the capacity for accessible military operation, and the struggle for liberation of Palestine, led by the armed resistance, must be brought back to center stage in order to not stagnate the struggle any longer. So on October 7th, 2023, Al-Aqsa Flood, the military operation, was launched. Before we get into what actually happened on Al-Aqsa Flood, it's important to understand the goals that this operation was launched with. First, the freedom of the political prisoners. The Palestinian people have ordered their resistance forces to take the necessary actions to ensure the liberation of the Palestinian prisoners. This has long been one of the most important pieces of the Palestinian liberation struggle, as resistance leaders, oftentimes resistance fighters will go into prison, and when they are liberated, they come out as resistance leaders. Yahya Sinwar, the martyred head of the political bureau of Hamas, was himself freed in a 2011 prisoner exchange. Number two, the end of the siege of Gaza permanently. As we mentioned earlier, the Great March of Return was an 18-month-long popular uprising to attempt to break the siege. Over 70% of the Palestinian population of Gaza are refugees from the Nakba, denied the right to return to their home. Number three, the demand to end the desecration of holy sites, Christian and Muslim holy sites, particularly the Zionization of Jerusalem and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and for the end of the so-called two-state solution. No progressive voice should be calling for the two-state solution, as it is, in essence, permanent colonization. The path of return and liberation against imperialism and Zionism will only come through a unified people and their revolutionary unified armed forces. Okay, so what actually happened on October 7th, 2023? The operation began at 6:30 a.m. 5,000 rockets were launched into occupied Palestine from the Gaza Strip, and over 6,000 Palestinians breached the Gaza border fence using a combination of trucks, pickup trucks, motorcycles, bulldozers, speedboats, and famously the powered paraglider. Resistance fighters quickly took over and disabled Nahal Oz military base, the Storo police station, the Rain military base, which was the center of the Gaza division of the IOF, and the Erez crossing and Gaza liaison base. They were able to capture and hold over 250 hostages, which is the only way that they have in the past been able to liberate their prisoners. So using a variety of tactics, we discussed this border wall, this massive border wall that they spent over $1 billion on. Up here is a photo of one of the observation towers that had one of the automatic machine guns on it. And this is the after Hamas dropped a bomb on top of it using a quadricopter drone. Over here you can see, as rockets fire, a paraglider sailing over the border. And the resistance was able to completely overwhelm and disarm the surveillance structure that surrounds the Gaza Strip and breach the wall in 100 different places. They destroyed communication lines and successfully pushed their forces up to 15 miles into their ancestral homeland. On that day, we saw Palestinians walking onto their land, some for the first time in decades, with the mythical Zionist entity burning. This is a video of one of the breaches of the Gaza fence. So you see a bulldozer.
ايوه كسر يسعد الله اشرده يا خيبتي الله اكبر ايوه روح يا شباب هجموا نزل الله اكبر.
Okay, so now we want to talk a bit about violence. So as materialists, our commitment to materialism goes for both capitalist and resistance forces. So we have to be able to understand and deal with the reality of the situation, regardless of the actors. Now, in typical rule of warfare, the targeting of any civilian is often considered a war crime. But wars of liberation from colonization, and particularly settler colonization, do not operate in accordance with typical rules of war. A settler does not play the typical role of a civilian. They are occupying stolen indigenous land and living off of its wealth. Their existence and subsistence depend on the subjugation and the killing of the native. This quote on screen is from revolutionary psychiatrist Frantz Fanon, one of the preeminent theorists on decolonization. He wrote extensively on the role violence plays in decolonization as he witnessed the violent revolution in Algeria to free itself from French colonization. Would someone be able to read this quote here?
Colonialism is violence in its natural state, and it will only yield when confronted with greater violence.
So we also understand, this is a quote here from Yahya Sinwar, who we talked about earlier. Would someone be able to read this one?
Whoever knows what war is doesn't like war. I'm not saying I won't fight anymore. Indeed, I'm saying that I don't want war anymore. I want the end of the siege. You walk to the beach at sunset, you see all these teenagers on the shore chatting and wondering what the world looks like across the sea, what life looks like. It's breaking. It should break everybody. I want them to break.
So this is one of my favorite quotes. I think about it like every day. But I think this helps illustrate that there is no love of violence, but an understanding that violence must be endured and used in the struggle for liberation. This is understood innately by generations of revolutionaries who have struggled against colonization and fascism. Finally, I want to read another quote from Fanon, which says, "The last shall be the first. Decolonization is putting into practice of this sentence. The naked truth of decolonization evokes for us the searing bullets and bloodstained knives which emanate from it. For if the last shall be the first, this will only come to pass after a murderous and decisive struggle between the two protagonists." So a lot of times we hear the number thrown around of 1,200, 1,400, however many people killed on October 7th. And it is almost always taken for granted and assumed that all of these deaths were caused directly by the resistance forces, which are often reduced to Hamas. But we know that at the end of the fighting, 1,175 people were dead. Of the settlers who were dead, 379 of them were part of the security forces. An additional 690 were civilian settlers in the sense they were not active duty soldiers of police. But we must note, along with the caveats we've talked about with settlers in general, within the Zionist entity, every settler over the age of 18 must serve within the genocidal Zionist military forces. But still, out of those 690 civilians, 36 of them were under 18 and were children. So how do we account for this? There's an Israeli policy called the Hannibal Directive. This is an official policy, well documented, that says a dead settler is better than a live hostage. It was created in 1986 after 1,150 Palestinian prisoners were freed in exchange for 3 captured Israeli soldiers. The Zionist entity did not want to be forced into negotiations, and so they developed this directive that says a dead Israeli is better than a live hostage. How do we know that this was employed on October 7th? First, we should remember that the Zionist entity first reported that 1,400 settlers had been killed, before realizing that 200 bodies were actually Palestinian militants burned beyond recognition. The Palestinian militants who crossed over the Gaza border on that day carried primarily small handheld arms, machine guns, and small grenades. They did not have the firepower for this type of destruction, but Israel does. Israel media has, in the months following Al-Aqsa Flood, revealed that the Hannibal Directive was first employed less than an hour after the breach of the Gaza border fence at the Eretz border crossing to prevent soldiers from being taken hostage there. Documents obtained by Eretz and testimonies of soldiers show that the use of the Hannibal Directive became widespread after order was issued to the Gaza division that, quote, not a single vehicle can return to Gaza. At 2 p.m., all units were instructed not to leave border communities or chase anyone into Gaza, as the border was under heavy, indiscriminate fire. We also know that Boeing-made Apache attack helicopters were used. Pilots say that they scrambled to the battlefield with no intelligence, unable to differentiate between Hamas fighters and Israeli non-combatants, and yet determined to, quote, empty the belly of their war machines. The Eretz border, where the Hannibal Directive was first employed, they ordered an airstrike upon the border, upon that base while they were still inside. There's also an interview that happened a few days after October 7th with the settler Yasmin Parat, who was in the Gaza envelope on October 7th. This has been siloed primarily and kept on Hebrew-only websites, but Electronic Intifada, great news source, did a translation of it. So I'm going to read a few notes from this interview. And again, this is Yasmin Parat, who was the settler who was in the envelope at this time on October 7th. Parat, quote, "They did not abuse us. We were treated very humanely. No one treated us violently because their objective was to kidnap us to Gaza, not to murder us. There are 5 or 6 hostages that were lying on the ground outside, just like sheep to the slaughter between the shooting of our fighters and the terrorists." Interviewer, "The terrorists shot them?" Parat, "No. They were killed by the crossfire." The interviewer, "So our forces may have shot them." Parat, "Undoubtedly." Interviewer, "When they tried to eliminate the abductors, Hamas?" Parat, "They eliminated everyone, including the hostages." A separate report published by Eretz also noted that the Israeli military was compelled to request an aerial strike against its own facility. Another report found that the army was only able to restore control at the village of Beray, after shelling the homes of Israelis who've been taken captive. This image here is of a kibbutz, a concrete home destroyed. Again, the Palestinian militants did not have the type of weaponry to cause this type of destruction. And there are videos that you can see of Israeli media at kibbutz Beray after, where you see tank treads in the grass. So to sum up, we know that there is video evidence of Palestinian militants targeting and killing civilian settlers on October 7th. This is not for us to judge how the colonized treats the settler who lives off his land, but there is no evidence whatsoever that they targeted children. We do, however, have evidence that the Israeli military does routinely target children. We know this. We also know that they employed the Hannibal Directive on October 7th. It is almost certain that the Israeli military killed these children, but as is routine, the Israeli military has denied access to any sort of international investigation. We also need to think and consider our role as settlers, citizens, or others who are in the imperial empire that is funding and arming this genocide. For us to sit in the armchairs in the West and to see the horror of the Zionist entity unmasked, and to dictate and police how the Palestinian people on the front lines in Gaza pursue their liberation takes an almost laughable amount of arrogance. I want to end with this quote from Ismail Haniyeh, another martyr who was the political head of Hamas before Sinwar took over. Would someone be willing to read this?
Our objective is clear. We want to liberate our land, our holy sites, our Al-Aqsa Mosque, our prisoners. We have no hesitation about this. This is a goal that is worthy of this battle, worthy of this heroism, worthy of this courage. Al-Qassam brigades made the enemy lose its balance in just a few minutes. With this grand and blessed incursion, with this epic presence of men who write history with their blood and their guns, with their footsteps that crush the occupying invaders.
So now that we understand why resistance is necessary, we also have to understand the methods the Zionist state uses to discredit and slander the Palestinian resistance. Particularly, Western media has taken two lies and reported them as fact to the broader public, one about systemic mass rapes and the other one about supposed beheaded babies. Israel has purposely used the racist weaponization of sexual assault to slander the Islamic resistance. Particularly, Israel uses Islamophobia's influence on the West in order to conjure up a dehumanized conception of resistance fighters themselves. During the PR push launched by Israel to cover its escalation of its genocide, Zionist media did everything it could to make sexual assault inseparable from Palestinian resistance. Claims of mass systemic rape were pushed by the IOF and Israel's foreign ministry. This was the version of events which many Western media sources went with, taking Israel at its word while not doing the due diligence to follow up on these claims. However, since Al-Aqsa, both Israeli investigators and Western media outlets have been unable to substantiate these lies. The most famous report on this narrative was published by the New York Times in an article which has now thoroughly been debunked by both fact checkers and witnesses in the article itself. The New York Times identifies 4 eyewitnesses for alleged incidents. Each of these eyewitnesses lack credibility, either because their stories are inherently unlikely or they're outright impossible. Things like just not being in the area where the incident supposedly occurred. There's also a total lack of corroboration with no physical or forensic evidence proving these allegations. The story sources often come from the IDF and the family of Galabush, one of the article's main supposed victims, spoke out after the article was published, claiming that there was no evidence and that they did not believe that she was assaulted and that they had been actively manipulated by the reporters themselves. Israel has launched its own investigation, eager to back up the public narrative about Hamas committing these acts. However, the investigation stalled, and after a year, they were unable to find a single provable instance and unable to find a single person claiming to have been assaulted. After a year of searching, in the end, they had to admit we have no complainants. But even more straightforwardly, thoroughly debunked is the beheaded babies myth. The source of the claim was not any newspaper or independent investigation. It was just the IOF. The Zionist military claimed that they had testimony from their soldiers that Hamas had beheaded babies, and Western media outlets ran with the story without any fact checking. Things began to break down once Biden claimed to have seen a video showing the event, and then had to backtrack and admit that the video he was talking about did not exist. However, investigators did eventually look into these accusations, and the short story is no one can back it up. Journalists who were there around say they did not hear anybody talk about any incidents like that, and no evidence of was ever actually found. The IOF itself refused to launch an investigation, claiming that the testimony of its own soldiers was all the evidence it needed to know that the accusations were true. It is a matter of public record at this point that these allegations are completely false. It's not even up for debate. These were just straight up made up to slander the resistance, and no one who's actually serious about investigating them actually believes them. So going into a 5-minute discussion, what did you learn about the Al-Aqsa flood? What questions still remain? And how has propaganda surrounding served as justification for the genocide we're seeing today? I'll give you all like 5 minutes. So please turn to your neighbor.
we were discussing like basically it seems like for every lie that like the IOF sells, like you can't find any evidence of any Palestinians, Hamas or anybody doing it. But almost all of them is something that there's like unavoidable amounts of proof of the IOF doing. Like the whole killing babies thing, that's like you can't even avoid those videos on the internet anymore. Like it might not even be in your algorithm and you'll see that shit. Like that's how much they commit atrocities. So it's like the major highest level of projection like there is like out there. It's like insane. So,
Do you
Absolutely.
want to summarize for Jitsi?
Sorry?
Do you want to summarize for Jitsi?
Oh yeah, so for Jitsi, what he was saying was that there's an incredible amount of projection from the IOF and the accusations. It kind of lays at the armed resistance. Like, for example, they accuse the resistance of killing children, even though they themselves are killing children on a mass scale. It's absolutely true, especially when we consider the fact that Israel itself has thousands and thousands of hostages, and it regularly tortures them within its prisons. Not only that, but you have sexual assault also happening on a systemic level within those prisons. And you even had a member of the Knesset, which is Israel's legislature, saying that it should be legal and encouraged for IDF soldiers to sexually assault Palestinians. So really this complete projection onto the resistance of Israel's own conduct throughout the conflict. Is anybody else over there?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting that it happened at like 6:30 in the morning. I was wondering if there was like any strategic reasons for the timing and like how that might have played into like, I don't know, if like the IOF was like less, I don't know, had less people in the morning like at those areas or something like that. I would be interested in learning more about that.
For sure. Yeah, it's, I would imagine, I don't know like specifically, but I would imagine it is part of the element of surprise. Because one thing we do know for a fact was that Al-Aqsa did catch Israel completely off guard. And that's part of the reason why they feel the need to compensate by manufacturing these stories, because it ultimately proved that their decades of strategy and thought that they were inherently superior and that they could never be defeated were proven false, because they were completely caught off guard and had to retreat and had to give up territory and were in many ways defeated. And so the fact is that, yeah, I would imagine that the timing of the attack has a lot to do with the element of surprise and the complete destruction of the illusion of Zionist invincibility. Are there any other, or?
Yeah, I think the only thing I could find about timing when I was researching it was they gathered after dawn prayer and then prepared for it. But yeah, I wasn't able to find anything specifically about that. But yeah, there was a great report I read about one of the IOF soldiers who was trying to announce that it was happening, but she was crying too much.
I'll also say in Islam, dawn is a very holy time. So it's also sometimes you choose it because it's a holy thing.
Could you repeat that for Jitsi?
Yeah, so for Jitsi, someone asked if there was any significance to the timing of the attack. It seems to be like it could either do with the dawn's role in Islam. It could also do with just the element of surprise and catching the enemy off guard. We were talking about how the success of Al-Aqsa and the fact that it caught Israel completely off guard shattered the myth of like Zionist invincibility and taught them that they can't just keep putting these conditions on the Palestinian people without consequence. Were there anything else that people wanted to raise?
I was curious, maybe you alluded to this just a little bit, but like Western media really latches on to being Hamas and the direction of Hamas. That you were maybe suggesting there are like other resistance groups too, or like full collection of people. Could you just talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, we'll actually go into that later to the presentation. Sorry?
We repeat the question?
Yeah, so for those on Jitsi, it was, are there other groups that are involved in the Al-Aqsa Flood? The answer is yes. We'll go into specifics on some slides that we have lined up. Yeah, there's a hand over there.
Yeah, I had one. It's kind of combined of the third and second. I guess I hear people who even support Palestine be like, oh, well, actually Netanyahu moved troops to like the West Bank. He actually knew it was going to happen and let it happen. And I don't know, I guess, how would you respond to that, or like it's just this total like delegitimization of Palestinians to like resisting and controlling their own destiny type of thing?
For sure, yeah. Well, it has a lot to do with, remember those slides about the Iron Dome era? Israel did believe it was practically invincible. It believed with the Iron Dome and its military superiority that like it could just keep, bombing Gaza every once in a while. That would weaken Hamas, and then they wouldn't have to worry about it, right? So it's just the actions Netanyahu engaged in before October 7th were based on the premise that the resistance was something they could contain and just mow the grass. And that's why they were so unprepared for it, because they were fundamentally wrong.
Yeah, I think a lot about like Mal's idea of the paper tiger with this, like that these things are very real and violent, but they also at their core can be destroyed and ripped apart as well. There is evidence that the IOF was tipped off that Hamas was planning something, but as Octavian was saying, they were so like caught up in their own delusion of superiority that they didn't believe that Hamas would be capable of this level of incursion. And then, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I will pass it on to for an activity.
All right, so now we're gonna do a little activity. It's like a multiple choice questions, and don't just blurt out the answer, raise your hand, because we have prizes for if you get the correct answer. They're little stickers that show, it's like a Jerusalem postage stamp with Al-Aqsa Mosque on it. Super cute, so definitely try to get the right answer to win. So yeah, our first question is, what the Hamas green headband represents: A, a commitment to composting, B, the Saudi Arabia flag, C, Islamic faith, or D, a watermelon. Any guesses? Yes, you.
C.
Correct. The Hamas green headband represents the Islamic faith.
Yeah.
And next, what country or countries materially support the Palestinian resistance? A, Kuwait, B, Iran, C, Tunisia, D, Lebanon, E, B and D only, F, all of the above, or G, D and A only.
B.
That is correct.
Repeat the answer for Betsy.
The answer is E, which is B and D, which is Iran and Lebanon. Which was not a common myth about October 7th? A, babies were beheaded, B, kittens were intentionally killed, C, Iran was behind the whole thing, or D, children were used by Hamas as human shields. You in the back.
B.
Correct. Kittens were not intentionally killed, nor was it a common myth that they were. All right. Which organizations are on domestic terrorism watch lists in the United States? A, Antifa, B, the Animal Liberation Front, which is what the little picture refers to, C, abortion extremists, D, A and B, or E, all of the above. It's a tricky one. Yeah.
D.
You are incorrect.
Oh.
E? Yes, all of the above. And it literally is just called abortion extremists in quotes. It doesn't refer to like an organization or a group or anything. So, yeah. And our final question is, which is not a reason that October 7th was chosen as the time to deploy Al-Aqsa Flood? A, as a response to increased Zionist attacks in September 2023 on Al-Aqsa and other religious sites in Jerusalem. B, to target tourism, festivals, and social gatherings of settlers in October 2023. C, from intel that the occupation was going to invade Gaza in mid-October 2023. D, the 50th anniversary of the October War. Or E, Netanyahu waving a map of Palestine at the UN podium declaring all of the land to be his.
B.
Correct. That was not a reason that October 7th was chosen for Al-Aqsa Flood. And with that fun little activity, we are going to be having dinner. So people that registered get food first. We have banh mi's, tofu, pork, and chicken, as well as pad thai. If you did not register, please just wait 5 minutes for everyone else to get their food first. We should have enough for everyone in this room now. So, yes.
Super O's coming through with the bond lead.
On journalist Ahmad al-Najjar was killed and beheaded at 18 months old. His head was never found.
هذا الطفل تطاير من البرج المستهدف كما تشاهدون. يصعب الأهالي على الوصول إليه. تطاير من منزل إلى آخر هنا في هذا الاستهداف على مدينة غزة كما تشاهدون. هناك أيضا طفلة أشلاء عبارة عن أشلاء نتيجة هذا الاستهداف لهذا البرج في مدينة غزة كما تشاهدون.
This is recent when Israeli forces opened fire on These are images from when there was a strike on a school in Gaza City and Boeing bombs were used. And on the right is the image of a 5-year-old girl who is in the flames.
نفس هذه فيها نفس يا جماعة، فيها نفس. هذا في العين حقوا على الأطفال يا دكتور محمود. فيهم نفس هذول. من وين هذول؟ فيهم نفس.
This is a father and his child that were killed in an Israeli airstrike in a house in Deir al-Balah. As of May 27, 2025, the Palestinian Ministry of Health had stated that at least 54,056 Palestinians had been killed, including 17,400 children. And at least 123,126 Palestinians have been wounded since October 2023. However, as estimated a year ago by The Lancet, there are likely over 186,000 Palestinians that have been killed since October 2023. But keep in mind that that is from a year ago. War crimes and terrorism. May 27th recently marked the 800th claim that Israel had received of US weapons. That is 90,000 tons of weapons from the US supplied for the genocide. At least 90% of the population in Palestine, or 1.9 million Palestinians, have been displaced since October 2023. Over 1,000 families have been wiped off the civil registry. There is media suppression, and at least 216 journalists and media workers have been killed. At least 10,100 Palestinians are held in Israeli detention, and around 3,500 Palestinians are held in administrative detention, which means they are held without trial or charge. Displacement and targeting of refugee camps. On October 14th, 2024, Israeli forces struck the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital complex in Deir el-Balah refugee camp. This is where 19-year-old Shaban al-Dalou was burned to death with his mother, as you can see on the right image. On May 18th, at least 160 Palestinians were killed throughout Gaza. At least 40 of those killed were in Khan Yunis, where displaced Palestinians had set up a refugee camp. Since March 18th, Israel has issued displacement orders extending to 197.7 square kilometers and displacing an estimated 599,100 Palestinians in the span of 3 months. Says hospitals, places of worship, and schools have been bombed and destroyed, prisoners killed, and the streets filled with bodies. Not even a moment of safety in order to bury the dead. Do you hear us? Do you see our hospitals? Do you still believe that Israel has the right to defend itself and that what is happening is not a genocide? The targeting of hospitals and healthcare workers. On March 23rd, 15 Palestinian medics were killed by Israeli forces. They weren't able to recover the bodies for days and only have been able to recover 6 so far. On April 2nd, Israeli forces struck a clinic at the Jabalia refugee camp. At least 22 Palestinians were killed, and among them, at least 9 children were killed. There is footage of a baby, weeks old, decapitated. May 13th and 14th, Israeli airstrikes hit one of the last functioning surgical hospitals in Gaza, in Khan Yunis. At least 28 people have been killed and over 70 injured. On May 19th, the Nasser Medical Complex in Khan Yunis was striked. 30% of it was destroyed, and the majority of it was left unusable. The blocking of aid. Recently, March 2nd, Israeli authorities imposed a full blockade on Gaza, blocking critical supplies such as food, fuel, and medical supplies. On May 27th, Israeli forces opened fire on thousands of Palestinians as they were seeking aid at the distribution center in Rafah. At least 31 were killed and at least 200 injured. In the past weeks, hundreds have been killed and wounded at these points. These militarized points are controlled by Israel and the US and used as a means to further the genocide of Palestinians. Gideon's Chariots operation. On May 16th, Gideon's Chariots, the new Israeli intensified offensive military operation launches. Since the operation, in 48 hours, at least 200 Palestinians were killed by Israeli forces. May 16th to May 21st, in the days following the operation's launch, over 700 Palestinians have been killed and at least 2,104 injured.
The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine is a part of the Palestinian Liberation Movement. And the Palestinian Liberation Movement aims to build a democratic Palestine where all sorts of discrimination, either they are economical or religious or national or social, are supposed to be cancelled. We believe that because of the nature of contradiction, the Popular Front for the Liberation
It's okay. Do you want me to see the speaker in this one, or it seemed like someone else? Were you also playing it?
I can play it, maybe. So Jitsi can also hear it?
Oh yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
Of Palestine is a part of the Palestinian liberation movement, and the Palestinian liberation movement aims to build a democratic Palestine where all sorts of discrimination, either they are economical or religious or national or social, are supposed to be cancelled. We believe that because of the nature of contradiction between the Palestinian and the Arab National Liberation Movement and between the enemy, which is Israel and the world Zionist movement and the world imperialism, because of the nature of this contradiction, there is only one way to solve it, and that is through the people's armed struggle. This long people's war is supposed to be the way the people impose their will against their enemies and build the society where everybody in it, regardless of its religion or national background or economical situation, will be equal. I want first to notice that among the most dangerous weapons of our enemy is the weapon of words. They call it peaceful solution when it is in fact the capitulation conditions. We are against it exactly because it's not a peaceful solution. We are against it exactly because it is another phase of forcing the Palestinian and the Arab people to kneel under the will of their enemies and by the force of the superior weapons and armies. To us, the peace is the justice. And this is why we consider that our people's war must be the war which ends all the wars.
So now we're going to be going into actually who makes up the Palestinian resistance. Next slide. So first, a note on the word terrorist. The terrorist list is made by the Department of State, which goes through approval by Congress. It lists some genuine terrorist words such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but more often it's used as a powerful tool of state repression by listing groups who are simply opponents of the U.S.'s plans for global hegemony and control. It's used as a public cover for wars of devastation and came into particular use after the 9/11 attacks. We can clearly see that, first of all, we were earlier talking about projection and also the way that Israel is been terrorizing the Gazan population. We can see that first. We can see like repeatedly that it's the Zionist state who are the ones actually conflicting the terror in Gaza, and all of their claims were pretty clearly projection. We saw their claims about beheaded babies, and they're doing it themselves. The usage of the word terrorist is meant to further the campaign of dehumanization. And of the 28 groups first designated on the list in 1997, 25% of them were Palestinian. Groups remain sanctioned depending on their perceived threat to the U.S. empire, and it's also vital to note the rhetorical damages when movements in specific actions or terror attack. We often hear phrases like "we do not negotiate with terrorists," and that in this case effectively shuts down challenging who the real people inflicting the terror are. So moving on from that, who is the Palestinian resistance? We need to understand that resistance is not a monolith, that it is made up of different people and different groups with varying beliefs, but that they are all united in the fight for Palestinian liberation through armed resistance. So first, we have the Al-Aqsa Brigades, the armed wing of the Hamas movement, who are the elected government of Gaza. Their armed wing is named after a Palestinian leader who led the fight against colonialism in the 20s and 30s. Their program calls for the rejection of a two-state solution, the usage of armed resistance to fight back against Israel, and the incorporation of Islam into the resistance. The Mustafa Brigades are the armed wing of the Marxist Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Their political program calls for anti-capitalism and anti-imperialism through the lens of Marxism-Leninism. They are a secular movement who call for a secular state, and they also reject the two-state solution and also believe in using armed resistance to fight back against Zionism. Lastly is the Sharia al-Quds, which is an armed wing of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, founded in 1981. They're most closely tied to Iran in the axis of resistance, but it's more of a military organization and does not necessarily seek to govern. They also reject the two-state solution and use armed resistance to fight back against Zionist colonialism. So we see a wide variety of different perspectives and different beliefs amongst these groups, and then we see them uniting for a common cause against Israel and against its escalating genocide against the Palestinian people. This like goes to show that these are human beings who have different experiences, different opinions, and that they're not a monolith and they're not all just. Israel has this habit of trying to portray them as kind of having a groupthink or kind of all thinking the same. This is obviously not true. It's part of the dehumanization. And it's also worth noting that despite all these differences, they're still able to unite for a common cause. So moving on, we can talk about the resistance and why they are resisting, but ultimately it's best to go to them directly and see why. I'm gonna have people read out the next few slides. If anybody wanted to read out what this resistance fighter is saying.
We don't know what freedom is. We haven't traveled between cities. We've also never seen the sea. And they're asking why we're carrying arms.
شغلة أثرت فيي له استشهاد صاحبي مناسب تاريخ استشهاده بجزء 2013 استشهد أثر فيي كثير يعني إحنا اللي عايشين مع إسرائيل وإحنا بنقدر نقدر شو إسرائيل شو بدها. إسرائيل بدها كل فلسطين وبدها تقتل الشعب الفلسطيني وتشرده وبدها إيانا نبقى عبيد عندها. إحنا نقاوم الاحتلال. مستحيل إسرائيل تعمل حل ثاني غير المقاومة، إنه حل سياسي أو إنه في هدنة أو سلام. مستحيل. هسه لو تجيبي كل السلام اللي بالعالم تحطيه بضرب اسرائيل راح تلاقيهم ثاني يوم بيعملوا مستوطنات، ثاني يوم بقتلوا، ثاني يوم بيأسروا، يعني هم بيأسروا نسوان وبنات صغار وشباب صغار اشبال. هو احنا بنطلب من الشعب كله يكون ضد اسرائيل مش بس السلطه.
He says his dream is to see Palestine free so he can lead a regular life.
أعيش حياتي الطبيعية وبطش وبروح على البحر وبعمل كل اللي أنا نفسي فيه، كل اللي أنا بدي إياه. ولا طبيعة فلسطين بتجنن يعني، وأنا من الناس اللي بحب أروح واجي على الطبيعة، على الجبال وعلى البحر.
So once again, focusing on the humans who actually make up the resistance, Mohammed Daif is an example. He was leader of the Qassam Brigades and grew up in destitute conditions. He was imprisoned by the, grew up and was born in Gaza's Khan Yunis refugee camp, and was imprisoned by the occupation in 1989 and then again in 2000. Both experiences that shaped his eventual leadership. The occupation targeted his home in October of 2023, killing his brother and 2 other family members. He has been targeted by 9 assassination attempts, and Daif has sacrificed life and limb for his people. But the brutality of the occupation will never kill a people's ability to resist. You can jail, you can kill a revolution, but you can't jail or kill a revolution. Moving on. Does anybody want to read this one out?
We do not say this because we are a superpower, but rather because we are the people of this land and its rightful owners. We are Gaza's sky, air, sea, and sand, and we shall remind you on every turn that Gaza is the occupier's graveyard.
All right. There's a quote here about guerrilla warfare. Any volunteers to read it out?
The enemy advances, we move. The enemy camps, we harass. The enemy tires, we attack. The enemy retreats. It is a form of warfare that depends on the support of the broad masses of the people to sustain organized groups of resistance fighters, avoiding strength and striking at enemy weaknesses, of flitting around and of having no fixed position, and of subduing the enemy according to circumstances. What that means is to avoid large battles, leaving ground in favor of time, using time to build up popular will. That is the essence of asymmetrical war and guerrilla war.
Would anybody like to read this half?
These are notes that were left to the resistance fighters in homes in Gaza.
To the dear family, some of the household furniture, kitchen utensils, water, and food items have been used. Please forgive us, and may you be rewarded. Your brother fighters, we also promise you that no personal belongings were touched, and we have strived to keep the house as it is. May you be blessed.
Does anyone want to read this one?
I'll read it. O fighters, the house is yours and under your command. I have left you some food. Health and wellness to you, O heroes. As for you, the children of pigs, you will have only death, and your demise is just around the corner. We were displaced, and we will return to build and to fight.
ربنا يحميهم ويخفي عنهم ويقدمهم لقدام، واحنا بنقول للمقاومة قدمة سيري، احنا في ظهركم، احنا قويين فيكم، احنا قويين في المقاومة. ولليهود الصهيوني اوعى تفكر انه احنا خايفين، صغارنا تحت الركام ولكن ربنا معانا. ويا مقاومة اشتدي ومدي، احنا وراكم وفي ظهركم، مهما قصفوا جوامع، مهما قصفوا دور، مهما قصفوا مدنيين، مهما قصفوا اطفال، اشتدي يا مقاومة، يا بنموت مع بعض يا بنعيش مع بعض.
All right, so now we're going to have another small group share. I'll give you all a couple minutes, turn to your neighbors, and answer one or all of these questions. What did you know about the Palestinian resistance before this? What did you learn? And what do you still want to know? Turn to a neighbor and discuss. publicly celebrated the wins of the resistance. What are some things y'all pulled out of y'all's discussions? Anybody want to?
Palestinians support disobligate.
Absolutely, yeah. They support the resistance that is fighting freedom. Yeah. Absolutely. Anything else?
The breakdown of the different arsenals that the groups have is very interesting to me because I never really thought about that sort of thing at all, like the actual differences in material they have in the ways that they fight.
For sure. Just for Jitsi, like talking about the differences in the arsenals of the resistance groups, for sure, and like putting into context also how they're in different locations and have different access to different resources, but still attempt to resist with what they're able to acquire, for sure. Are there anyone else? Anyone from this side of the room?
Yeah, we just talked a little bit about how the resistance kind of gets generalized, like it's like the same dehumanization that Palestinians face the resistance, like which gets the same dehumanization, like when each like part of the resistance is dead, you know.
Yeah.
Different, but united for the same goal.
Absolutely. So for the folks on Jitsi, talking about how the resistance is usually kind of portrayed as a monolith, but however, as we like saw, there are different groups and different belief systems throughout the resistance, and that comprise it. And that like the idea of them being like a monolith is part of the dehumanization campaign waged by the Zionist entity. Anyone else? Anything interesting? All right, then. I think I will hand it off to.
Okay. So, regional armed resistance and armed struggle is winning. We're going to go through and talk a little bit about the significance of Al-Aqsa Flood in terms of just the globe and some of the regional actors that are striking serious blows against the Western world order. So first, another Islam quote, Al-Aqsa Flood changed the world. Would someone be willing to read this?
The myth of the land without a people for a people without a land, and the notion that the old will die and the young will forget, have ended forever. They intended the Nakba to destroy the Palestinian people and end their sacred cause. Yet the Palestinian cause remains strong in the consciousness of our people, our nation, and the free people of the world.
Yeah. One of the most significant pieces of the Al-Aqsa Flood was that it ruptured the world order that was being built. It refocused every person in the world onto the Palestinian cause and set it up as one of the forefronts of the struggle against the imperialist and capitalist domination. So who are the friends of the Palestinian resistance? An international resistance movement is growing against Zionism and imperialism, extending from Palestine to Yemen, to Iraq, to Iran, to Lebanon, and to all people fighting for justice and self-determination. We're going to go over three of the most important regional and military allies of the Palestinian resistance: Iran, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Ansar Allah in Yemen. So first, the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. So under Shah rule in the 70s, Iran and Israel had diplomatic relations, including a supply of Iranian oil to European nations and purported military partnerships. In contrast, the Iranian public, particularly the Muslim working class, was sympathetic to the Palestinians. The Shah rule even attempted to prevent such fundraising for the Palestinians on numerous occasions. But after the revolution and the fall of the Pahlavi dynasty in 1979, Iran adopted a sharp anti-Israel, anti-Western sovereign stance. Iran cut off all official relations with Israel, official statements, state institutes, and events. Iran ceased to accept Israeli passports, and the holders of Iranian passports were banned from traveling to, quote, the occupied Palestine. the Israeli embassy in Tehran was closed and handed over to the Palestinian Liberation Organization. You must understand that there is a direct link between the 1979 overthrow of the Shah and the material capacity of Hamas to launch Al-Aqsa Flood. Today, Iran continues to provide political and financial support and weapons to Hamas and to other actors in the axis of resistance, and have launched their own missiles into Israel following Al-Aqsa Flood. It is undeniable the role that Iran and the IRGC play in aiding the axis of resistance. Often we hear this trope in Western media that will disparage resistance groups as Iranian proxies. But this is infantilizing and a gross mischaracterization of what is, in essence, a coalition and allyship, a recognition that the primary contradiction in the region is imperialism and Zionism. Ansar Allah. Yeah. Let's clap for Ansar Allah. Ansar Allah is the de facto Yemeni government, and they are the only state to uphold the international duty to intervene in genocide. Through their strategic geographical positioning on the Red Sea, they have thrown a major wrench in the functioning of international capitalism through their blockade, bankrupting Israel's Eilat port and disrupting a quarter of all maritime trade in the world. They have also sent missiles that have exploded hundreds of meters away from the main terminal of David Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. These attacks have been able to penetrate the Iron Dome system, an apparatus upheld through Western money and power. For their solidarity, they have been bombed by the US empire. The Yemeni people have already suffered under decades of US-backed Saudi dirty war, and it is often ranked as one of the poorest countries in the world. But despite this, they have maintained an incredible amount of bravery and resistance. They understand their liberation is linked to the liberation of Palestine. This is a tweet from a Yemeni man that came out when the US first began bombing Yemen in March. Would someone be able to read this?
I can't read it from here or I would.
Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillah. These Israeli planes had not come to unload their bombs in Yemen. They would have unloaded their bombs in Gaza. Alhamdulillah, who enabled us to alleviate the suffering of the people of Gaza.
Every single week, there are million-man marches held in the capital of Sana'a in solidarity with the Palestinian people in defiance of the US empire and Zionism. After the bombings of Yemen by the US empire began in March, Ansar Allah, using a combination of Iranian, Chinese, Soviet, and homemade weapons, have successfully defeated the US empire and forced them to retreat from the Red Sea. And I cannot stress how incredible this is. It is indigenous people acting in solidarity with the indigenous people in Palestine, defeating and forcing into retreat the most powerful, technologically advanced empire that the world has ever seen.
When did that happen?
It was March to May, I think.
Really?
Early
May with the ceasefire.
Early May, yeah.
Okay.
And additionally, after the Israeli empire announced the start of the new military operation in the Gaza Strip, Operation Gideon's Chariots, which we talked about earlier, Yahya Saree, the spokesperson for the Yemeni military, declared a blockade of the Haifa port. He said, quote, "We alert companies whose vessels are currently docked at this port or headed towards it that Haifa has, from the moment of the statement's release, become one of our targets." Hezbollah is a political and religious party and non-state actor in Lebanon who came into the arena in the struggle against Zionism. After the invasion of southern Lebanon in the 1980s, Hezbollah was able to defeat the Zionist invaders in 2006. This was the first time the indigenous people were able to reclaim land that had been occupied by the Zionist entity, and it effectively shattered the Zionist plans for Greater Israel. In 2023, Hezbollah began to fire rockets into Israel in support of Al-Aqsa Flood. When Israel invaded again, they were met with a force that they could not defeat. The Zionist soldiers maintained serious losses, and Hezbollah was able to successfully force them to retreat from Lebanon and maintain their sovereignty. The US media often describes this as a ceasefire, but this is a rhetorical trick. We must be clear that Hezbollah defeated the Zionist entity for the second time. Yet again, we see the Zionist entity running back across the border like a dog with the tail between its legs. Of course, this came with huge sacrifices. The martyrdom of almost 4,000 Lebanese and the assassination of Syed Hassan Nasrallah in 2024, the Secretary General and political and religious leader for Hezbollah and Palestinian struggle for all of his life. This is a quote from Nasrallah. Everyone who tried to break the resistance has failed, because the resistance is not an organization, it is a public determination. And this is an image of his funeral. The axis of resistance remains intact, despite the US trying to rupture their supply networks and political networks. One of the developments that is also important is, even though Assad has fallen and has been taken over by a Al-Qaeda-linked US Zionist puppet, Jilani, it has not interrupted the ability of the resistance to function, because they have spent the last couple of decades building up capacity within their own countries to manufacture weapons, to repurpose weapons. One of the videos I was watching the other day was of Al-Qassam brigades, who took an unexploded US-made bomb that had fallen on Gaza. They took it, put it underneath the road, buried it, put a fuse on it, and then waited for a Zionist armored truck to drive over it and blew it up. Okay.
Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. For the last section, for going over these wins. We know we've thrown a lot of different information. Hopefully it has been like clarity, and for us, all of us in the movement together, learning about how can we improve our own rhetoric, our own understanding of the Palestinian struggle. And we hope this presentation has demonstrated that the actions of the resistance disrupted the existing notions of Israel, the normalization by reactionary regimes. It opened the eyes of people around the world. I know for me, it solidified some of our own conditions, just seeing the sheer amount of weapons, tax dollars that go toward funding this genocide, and the commonalities between Palestinian struggle and struggles all around the world. Finally, we hope, again, the encompassing presentation demonstrated the scientific necessity of the armed struggle, of the axis of resistance, of all these components, in order to end the conditions in Palestine, or the inhumane conditions in Palestine. So kind of the last discussion question before we go into like conclusion is, what does it mean to be in solidarity with the resistance? So I think we hopefully understand, right, this like the importance of the right to resist. What does it mean over here? What does it mean when the common narrative are so many of the things in this presentation that we have worked to dispel and clarify? And so one thing that comes to mind for me has been really expanding our understanding of history, like continually doing presentations like this, improving our research, being able to dispel these common rhetorical points like Israel has the right to exist. There is no international law decreeing the right of any country to exist, but it is enshrined in the UN as a human right that people who are occupied have a right to resist. So when people are saying things like Israel has the right, to defend itself, like if you don't feel that, if you want to just turn away, that's fine too. But like it's the application of international law is extremely biased toward the genocidal regime. That being said, the extent of international law is also limited. As we have seen, relying on legal frameworks and, the international community to open our eyes, and somehow the UN, we saw just in the last day, America or the United States voted for the 5th time to not recognize Israel's genocide on Palestinians, and kind of how terror tagging and international law work together to subdue resistance forces. As I stated earlier, or maybe I did, but another rhetoric point that I've been hearing a lot is like, oh, it's Netanyahu and it's the right-wing government. They're actually not the source of the problem. They are a symptom that will continue to happen if the settler-colonial entity is not completely dismantled. So something I heard too recently is that, okay, like Israelis are brainwashed, peace-loving people. Yeah, that's someone actually was in my messages saying that. People that are not fighting against genocide actively, that are benefiting from being settlers, are not peace-loving people. And we should never conflate these kinds of words. As we talked about, reiterating that being in touch with the resistance, who they are, what's motivating them, assuring them that Palestinian people actually have faith. There's another common rhetoric point of, it's ridiculous. I've seen stickers around here like, well, there was originally like Hamas is ISIS, or essentially this rhetoric that, oh, if Hamas put down their weapons, there would be no genocide, there would be no war. Equivocating Hamas to the IOF, saying that, oh, they're not speaking on behalf of Palestinians. The fact is that Hamas is true. It was literally an elected body, first of all, and make no mistake that Israel, the U.S., and the PA, who literally gunned down their own people, are the ones facilitating and accelerating this genocide. Okay, yes. Palestinian people have the right to take up arms, resist by any means necessary, and how they see fit. So, yeah, once again, if people start saying those things, I think returning to like what is the truth of the matter? What is really facilitating this genocide? I think that has been really helpful. Okay, last video. To close us out, we are going to play a speech by Charlotte Cates, International Coordinator of Samidoun, the Palestinian Prisoners Network, who has also been terror attacked in their own way. In response to the surveillance and repression of a pro-Palestine protest in Ottawa, where they said long live October 7th, Charlotte Cates came out to support by shouting long live October 7th in Vancouver. She was arrested, forbidden to attend political events and protests for a period of time. And I think her speech will show that we have to be loud in defense of our comrades and in defense of the Palestinian struggle. Okay. Sorry. No, one more.
I want all of us to not be silent about the resistance, to not be silent about the armed resistance, and to be loud and clear about it, and to say that it is true that October 7th changed the world, because October 7th not only threw the mask off of these imperialist states who use language of human rights in order to invade countries and depose their leadership and destroy self-determination, but what it also did is it showed that Palestine is almost free of Zionism from the river to the sea. And it showed that the people of the region, from Palestine to Lebanon to Iraq to Syria to Iran to every country and every people in the region, and all of us around the world, are part of an international resistance movement that is on the path to seeing the region free of imperialism and all of our world, a new collective liberation for all of humanity. Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Hezbollah, not names to be ashamed of. These are not names to be afraid of. These are the names of those who fight and sacrifice for all of us and for a better world. And so what can we do here? Well, we can camp in on campus. What can we do here? We can boycott Indigo and Starbucks and McDonald's and Scotiabank and all the other war profiteers. We can get in the streets and we can be loud. And we can say that we demand every resistance organization is off the so-called terror list, and the Zionist regime and the settler funders here are on it instead. Because everything that we can do is just to live up to the example that the resistance fighters set every day. Yes, with their guns, with their missiles, and with their rockets, but also with their medicine, with their books, with their love, and with their hope and joy for the future of a liberated Palestine and for the future of humanity, and for one resistance front that stretches from Palestine to Yemen, to Syria, to Iran, to Iraq, to every single one of us that is committed to see the end of Zionism, the end of imperialism, and victory for Palestine! Victory for the resistance! From the river to the sea! From the river to the sea! Palestine is almost free! Palestine is almost free! Long live the resistance! Long live the resistance! And free, free Palestine!
Just to recap, obviously very powerful. Charlotte Cates, always a pleasure to hear. I think she listed a lot of calls to action too, beyond just, dispelling rhetoric of targeting the entities that should be on the terror list, the ones that are facilitating this genocide, the ones that are dismantling Palestinian statehood and Palestinian struggle. And one thing I forgot also to mention is that, polls show a lot. Polls, once again, the majority of Palestinians in Gaza support Hamas. Just go ahead.
There's also a poll that just most recently came out, shows that there's a bit of a variance on specific political parties that Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza support, but overwhelmingly upwards of 86% of the people in Gaza, even more in the West Bank, say that even if it would end the war, they do not want Hamas to disarm. There is an understanding that the armed resistance is needed and necessary and must be protected in order to liberate Palestine.
Okay, I might actually jump ahead to one more thing before we do small group share as well, just because I know people have to head on the next 10, but we have our telegrams for Super UW here, and also Nidal, who's tabling. Please go talk to them. Feel free to talk about the discussion questions with them. But in the end, and on Tuesday, big announcement and flyer yet to be made. We're going to have a rally in defense of, the UW 33. I was like, could be many things. Students and community members who were arrested for pointing out these very contradictions that we talked about in the presentation. Tuesday, 5:30. It should be posted on these telegrams, both of them. U District Light Rail, walking down that march route, but it's mostly off campus for those who need to know that. But yeah, like I said, I'd love to hear a share out after 5 minutes of discussion, but like I said, wanted to get these action items out of the way. And thank you all so much for coming to this event, participating, taking time out of your day to hopefully have questions be answered. And now you can answer these questions too when people ask what really happened, what were the goals, And why are we supporting the resistance today? Okay. Okay, we can go back to the small picture if you guys want, but do we have extra food too and anything or?